just a few seconds and now we will begin. Again, sorry, Angela, for the wait. Perdón a todas y todos. It's the fun of having an institution that is in 3 different time zones, or 2, yeah, no, 3. Todas y todos, les doy la más cordial bienvenida a esta sesión del ciclo de seminarios del proyecto Ciudades Santuario como Fronteras Emergentes. El día de hoy tenemos el gran gusto de tener la ponencia de la doctora Ángela García de la Universidad de Chicago, Strategic System Seeking, When and Why Undocumented Immigrants Seek Out Chicago's Municipal ID. Y voy a empezar nada más un poco en español, pero la presentación será en inglés. Vamos a tener igualmente una sesión de preguntas y comentarios al final. Se puede preguntar en cualquier de los 2 idiomas y vamos a igualmente tener tiempo justamente para esa conversación al final para los que están viendo por YouTube. Entonces, si quieren escribir sus comentarios ahí, vamos a leerlos y seguir la conversación de esa forma. Entonces, presento rápidamente a la doctora. La doctora Ángela García es socióloga y doctora por la Universidad de California, San Diego. Trabaja temas de inmigración internacional, estudios jurídicos, sociales, de raza, etnia, sociología urbana y política pública, así como métodos mixtos y comparativos. Ha trabajado mucho sobre las leyes de inmigración locales de los estados federados de Estados Unidos y locales de municipios, condados, y sobre todo cómo esas leyes afectan las vidas cotidianas de las y los migrantes que están en Estados Unidos. Es autora del libro Legal Passing, Navigating Undocumented Life and Local Immigration Law, publicado por la editorial de University of California Press en 2019, y también es miembro del proyecto. Entonces, muchas gracias, Ángela, por aceptar estar aquí hoy con esta ponencia, y te doy la palabra. Gracias.
Muy buenos días, y me gustaría empezar dándole a Benjamín las gracias por haberme invitado. Y a los que están presentes les agradezco haber venido y espero que la charla sea de su interés. De antemano les quiero pedir directamente una disculpa. Acepté la invitación de hoy con la idea de compartir con ustedes un trabajo de un proyecto más grande sobre la identificación municipal en Chicago. Ese proyecto lo estoy llevando a cabo con 2 colegas, Marcia Ibarra en la Universidad de Wisconsin y Yanilda González en Harvard. El título del trabajo lo tienen ahí adelante en la diapositiva. Con el apuro del comienzo del nuevo semestre, pues no alcancé a traducir la charla al español y les pido muchas disculpas. No duden, por favor, en pararme en cualquier momento con preguntas o dudas o clarificaciones. Y con eso dicho, pues para comenzar la charla, les voy a presentar a Carmen.
Ángela, tienes el micrófono cerrado. El micrófono arriba, donde está el icono. Perfecto, ya.
¿Me estás oyendo ahora?
Ahora perfecto. Ahora con Carmen.
¿Y antes no habían escuchado nada?
No, sí, todo después de, vamos a presentarles a Carmen.
Ok, perfecto, muchas gracias. Okay, entonces con Carmen. Carmen and I met on an early summer morning in 2018. She was the first in line along a squat brick building in her Chicago neighborhood. She was 43 years old, a Latina without authorized immigration status, and had to give up her shift at a restaurant to obtain City Key, Chicago's municipal ID card. Carmen held an oversized umbrella, which had protected her from rain when she arrived to get a place early in line at 3 a.m. that morning. The enrollment site, which was at a community-based organization, would not open until 9 a.m., which was the time that I arrived. When the day-long event began, the line wrapped around the block when nearly 200 people gathered to request a government-issued municipal ID card. So that Carmen, a Latina with low income, no high school degree, and an undocumented immigration status, was seeking out the state via an ID program is in many ways remarkable. Why is it remarkable? Well, because a long line of scholarship suggests that people like Carmen who are experiencing poverty, racism, and all forms of exclusion are likely to avoid precisely this sort of contact with the state. Largely due to their treatment across a range of policy domains, people like Carmen often view government as a punitive and surveilling force. The literature on policy feedbacks tells us that these experiences then contribute to negative orientations to government, including alienation and withdrawal. So here the idea is that engagement with the state entails risk. And government-issued ID documents are linked to states' efforts to extract resources, exert social control, and surveil and make populations legible. All of these insights are connected to the concept of system avoidance, the idea that when people are in marginalized groups, they may avoid government and its associated record-keeping systems. At the same time, though, marginalized communities also disproportionately need to rely on the state for essential services. And access to many of these services and supports and facilities and transactions, as well as mobility and the expression of basic needs, hinge on government-issued IDs. Without one, it's hard to rent an apartment. It's hard to pick up a kid from school or a prescription from the pharmacy, identify yourself to the police, or engage in formal banking. And less tangibly, of course, government-issued IDs also signal membership in a political community and associated rights. But of course, acquiring an ID requires interaction with the state, and having one makes you more legible to government, increasing the potential for surveillance and punishment. So in summary here, municipal ID programs, like the one that Carmen was seeking out, represent rights, benefits, and access at the local level, but require engagement with government that may be seen as a threat. So this leads me to the research questions that are guiding this piece of the study. When do people who face overlapping systems of marginalization and the punitive arm of government seek out the state for needed supports and services? This question centers marginalized groups from below. And then, can the state incentivize system engagement among marginalized groups by extending access to a needed service through policy design? Here, this question takes a top-down perspective focused on the role of the state from above. And I'm going to draw on evidence from undocumented immigrants enrolled in Chicago's municipal ID program here to help answer these questions and share some of the research with you today. So in this piece, we are developing a theory of relational engagement between marginalized communities on the one hand and the state on the other. We develop one concept we have called strategic system seeking, and here we're describing given a greater need to access resources and to minimize risk, people from marginalized groups have strong incentives to identify and engage the parts of government that reduce risks and costs, the parts of government that may seem more receptive to their needs. Given the risk of engaging government systems, these groups arguably have the most at stake in discerning favorable venues. From the state side, the theoretical framework, as I've suggested, is relational. So from the state side, this includes what we're calling administrative justice, the intent and response of state actors. So I think it's important to underscore that some areas of government, some areas of the state may not be seeking to surveil and punish, but rather to encourage strategic system seeking among marginalized groups and using policy design to do this. So to this end, administrative justice refers to policy design that attempts to attenuate the inequitable constituent state interactions, broadening the policy and including more people in the program. Specifically, the administrative justice design of the policy I'm referring to today reduces threat, reduces administrative burdens, understood as costs imposed by state actors in order to purposefully limit program take-up, and also enact universal framing to counter to be outed as belonging to a stigmatized group. So following again the policy feedback literature here, what we're arguing is that this policy design induces strategic system seeking amongst marginalized groups who are likely to perceive a policy with these kinds of administrative justice features as a receptive government arena, as a place they might be able to go to get a needed service without facing threat from the state. So we're hoping that this kind of framework will help us understand why people like Carmen, who face overlapping systems of marginalization, seek out the state for needed services and support. Let me turn a bit up to background here. Why are we focusing on cities? Well, cities are the most important, or I'm sorry, the most immediate face of government, kind of the face of government that we might interact with on a more daily basis. And they're also sites of policy innovation, often in response to pressing urban challenges that in the United States are left unaddressed by state and federal gridlock, inaction, or retrenchment. So, for example, cities in the United States are developing policies around universal basic income, minimum wage, reparations, gun control, climate change, immigration, and government-issued identification. So with all that cities do, why would they focus on identification? Why develop identification at the municipal level? As I've already suggested, access to institutions and services and support, these aspects of membership in a city really hinge on the ability to produce a valid government-issued ID. And in the United States, this ID is traditionally offered through states or the federal government. We have no national ID card in the United States. And so what this means is that it's oftentimes out of reach for groups already excluded from full participation in society, and even more so after two laws were passed post the 9/11 attacks, the Patriot Act and the Real ID Act, that made it much more difficult to get, for example, a driver's license. You can see on the slide here a mock-up of a driver's license in Illinois, the state where I live in the United States, that is available to people without authorized immigration status. But you can see that this ID, due to aspects of the Patriot Act and the Real ID Act, is flagged as not valid for identification. So in response to some residents' difficulty in accessing U.S. government-issued ID, there's been a rise of municipal ID programs in the United States since the 2000s. This study is focused on CityKey in Chicago, and it was the first municipal ID program to unfold under the Trump administration, notoriously hostile to immigrants, and in fact has had a lot of legal wranglings with the city of Chicago itself. So there's at least two sets of sensitivities to CityKey and all municipal ID programs in the US right now. There's tensions between local, state, and federal governments, concern that municipal ID on enrollees will be targeted. We've seen this happen in New York City, where two people of the state assembly were trying to access the identifying information of people enrolled in New York municipal ID program. Also happened in New Haven, the first municipal ID program to open up. And then there's also tensions between marginalized groups in the state. How does a city systematically reach people who may not want to be in contact with the state? So I want to show you some scope of municipal IDs in the United States. This is a very modest chart, but it took a really long time to come to this number. So there are 39 active municipal ID programs in the United States in effect currently. There's 30 more under consideration. I'm glad to tell you how we came to this determination if you're interested in the Q&A. There are also some counties that are trying to issue county level IDs. There are 4 active county ID programs currently, 7 more under consideration. Finally, in researching this, we came across what we're calling community IDs. There's 30 of these in effect right now in the United States. These are identification programs that are issued by non-government entities. So it's a nonprofit, a church, another kind of faith group. These IDs, I think, are outside of the scope of the present work, in part because they might have approval or support of local government, but they're not officially issued by these entities. However, we're still interested in them, thinking that they might serve as like a trampoline towards or a step towards an eventual formal municipal ID program. So we're keeping them on our radar. If you're interested, here's where current municipal ID programs live in the United States. You can see the red dot on Chicago, just to indicate that that's where I'm going to be focusing the remainder of my remarks. But I wanted to give you a sense of where these are in the U.S. You can see the East Coast has a bunch of these. We've also got a lot on the West Coast, some in the Midwest, and then Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas is our outlier in the South. So we have a team of research assistants doing write-ups of all of these municipal IDs to help us understand how they evolve in a place like Little Rock versus a place like Chicago. So let me give you a bit of background on Chicago's municipal ID, again called City Key. This came to be due to an early collaboration between the mayor's office. This was a time when Rahm Emanuel was mayor of Chicago, and a new office opened up in Chicago and in the state of Illinois, the Office of New Americans. This is an office funded by the state to do integration type work with immigrant community across the state and in particular in Chicago. In October of 2016, the Chicago City Council allocated $1 million out of the budget to create this municipal ID program. And then about a year later, in April 2017, the City Council passed an ordinance to give the authority to design, administer, and implement this program to the office of the city clerk. And so the program began in May 2018. And in the first year of the program, 36,000 people in Chicago enrolled. So Chicago's Office of the City Clerk partnered with 33 community-based nonprofits to design, implement, and reach marginalized groups with this municipal ID program. And I have to underscore that following the 2016 election of Donald Trump as president, fears of a hostile federal administration really exacerbated concern about the vulnerability of municipal ID programs and the data that they might be collecting on people. And so partnership between the city and these organizations fundamentally informed the administrative justice policy design of the card. What I want to do now is sort of talk you through the pieces of this, but really emphasize to you here, the only thing you get off of this slide is the fact that the municipal ID card in Chicago does not collect data on anybody. So in terms of reducing threat, I said that was a key aspect of what we're calling administrative justice here. The city cannot tell you whether or not I have a municipal ID card. They can't tell you whether or not anyone has one. The only thing they can tell you is how many have been issued up to now. Moreover, the city partnered with community orgs, as I said, issued the card citywide and mobile enrollment sites, and did utmost to reduce threat. In terms of reducing administrative burden, the card is free, it's accessible, information on the card is available in multiple languages. To receive this ID, you do have to prove that you live in Chicago and that you are who you say you are, but a lot of flexibility around required documents here, and a lot of assistance from community org partners to get people enrolled. Finally, in terms of universal framing, to make this a card that is appealing to a broad range of people living in Chicago, not just people who have a marginalized or stigmatized identity, like an undocumented immigration status, or for example, someone who's formerly incarcerated, experiencing homelessness, someone who's transgender, whose gender marker on, let's say, a driver's license doesn't match the gender that they feel they're expressing in the world. All of these are reasons and ways that the city marketed the card to make it popular to a broad audience, with the idea that then it wouldn't serve as an outing of a stigmatized status, right? So the card offers discounts to restaurants, to museums and the like, a benefit for prescription drug medicines. You can put your transit card and your library card on the city key card. You choose your own gender marker. You can add your emergency contacts, your medical, your allergy info, and the like. So I want to turn now to the data that we've collected on this project and the methods. I'm going to draw a little bit on analysis from an original survey that we collected and follow up in-depth interviews. Again, because no administrative data exists on this municipal ID program, when we decided we wanted to study it, we realized we had to collect our own data, do our own survey. And so we conducted a short original survey on city key enrollees. We began on the very first day of the program being available to the public, which was May 1st, 2018. And we went the entirety of the program's first year through April 30th, 2019. The survey asked respondents to self-report demographic information, reasons for city key enrollment, and barriers due to lack of a government ID, among other questions. This really gave us a sense of who was enrolling in city key and why. To recruit respondents, we put trained multilingual research assistants and enrollment sites across the city of Chicago. We were at 93% of these events that took place during the study's timeframe. Enrollees took the survey, which was available in 6 languages on tablets, and all of these efforts yielded a sample of 7,439 respondents, which is 20.1% of all 36,000 city key enrollees during the first year. So after we did that, we collected in-depth interviews, a total of 196, with a purposive sample culled from survey respondents who consented to a follow-up interview. We did these between May 2019 and March 2020. I'm glad to talk about what we did in March 2020 when we were in the field as the pandemic hit. And we went through 3 stages of sampling to center those who were in marginalized groups, who had the municipal ID card for at least 6 months, and then we drew a random sample across these groups to recruit. We yielded this final interview sample of 196 municipal ID holders from marginalized groups. The interviews averaged an hour and a half to 2 hours and centered on many things, but among them, what you see on the slide here, experiences using the ID card kind of out in the world, the enrollment process, and then a battery of questions around political trust, work and income, well-being, family, and household composition and the like. Here's an overall overview of demographic characteristics of both our survey and our interview samples. I know these numbers might look very small on your screen. And because in this analysis, I'm centering only on immigrants, I'll just point out that on this survey, we did not ask about immigration status. We asked about citizenship status. For the survey, non-citizens make up 45% of the survey sample, an N of 3,381. For the interviews, undocumented, we did ask about documentation status in the interviews, I should say directly. So for the interviews, I can say with certainty that we have 42% of the interview sample is undocumented, an N of 82. I think I'll skip this slide in respect of the time here, but I'm glad to talk about how we went, the methods behind how we went about analyzing these interviews. I will say that kind of going through this process with 196 interviews and a team of researchers really pushed us to look at emerging findings quite carefully. And it was here where patterns of strategic system seeking, these behaviors that we're calling strategic system seeking, and its connection to what we understand to be the administrative justice features of the City Key program emerged as really important findings, and we began to develop them in the analysis. So to start off here, first, do we center immigrants, do immigrants face barriers due to lack of ID? I want to establish a baseline here of who in the survey did not have any government ID at all, and really emphasize that in our 21.5% of the sample did not have any government ID at all, not just no US government issued ID. This was a larger number than we had expected. Of these, 33% were non-US citizens, 30% were Asian, 23 were from Latin America or defined themselves as Latinos, and 20% were Black. I should also note that of those without any government issued ID, 48%, almost half, had a high school education or less. So you can start to see some intersecting factors here and who does and does not have ID in this larger project that, of course, has immigrants and immigration at the heart of it, but is also touching on other marginalized groups socioeconomically and likewise in the city of Chicago. As you can see on this slide, the stakes of not having an ID can be quite high. So in the survey we asked, have you had difficulty with the following due to lack of a US government issued ID? You can see divergences, but also similarities when we look across race and ethnicity. So for respondents who identified as Latinx, the biggest barrier was entering public or private buildings, followed by showing ID to police. For Black respondents, the biggest barrier was accessing city housing services, followed by showing ID to police. And for Asian respondents, the biggest barrier was accessing general city services, again, followed by showing ID to police. Really kind of important finding across all groups here. And discrepancies are even larger when we start to look across citizenship status. So here, same question, have you had difficulty with the following due to lack of government issued ID? For non-citizens, we see especially high barriers when it comes to entering buildings, showing ID to police, accessing financial services, and accessing healthcare. So our qualitative interviews are going to point to the difficulties that undocumented immigrants in particular encountered in navigating everyday life without the US government issued ID. And so I'm going to go to those now and begin with Carmen. Remember Carmen who started us off at the very beginning of the talk and flesh out some of the barriers that she experienced. So Carmen was 53, originally from Ecuador, and had lived in the United States for over 20 years without immigration status. She didn't drive, but she had a consular ID card for identification purposes. But that consular ID card proved inadequate. For example, she was trying to take an English as a second language class at a library. The library required that students check out materials, but they did not let her use her consular ID card as a form of ID in order to get a library card. When her kids were school age, Carmen also had trouble entering their schools, which required ID from visitors. I couldn't prove I lived here, even after all this time, Carmen said. Another example comes from Enrique. Enrique was 52 years old, undocumented from Mexico, and he said, we had a problem with the pharmacy. They didn't want to sell us the medication. Even though we had the matricula consular, they did not accept it. They didn't accept my wife's matricula. They wouldn't accept her passport. One always feels bad because you feel different from other people, especially because there's people right behind you watching. Another example comes from Rosa. Rosa is 40 years old, undocumented from Honduras. She noted the uncertainty of interacting with the police with the only government-issued ID she has, which is her passport. She said, once I was stopped leaving Target because of a security tag left on my purchase. The officer asked me for ID. When I showed him my passport, all the questions started, and I was worried that I would be detained. So moving on to strategic system seeking. Given these ID barriers, but also the risk of interacting with the state as an undocumented person in the United States, do people without authorized immigration status identify City Key as a receptive arena? Is this a place where people felt welcoming and less under threat as a place where they could get a needed service like a municipal ID? One way of accessing strategic system seeking in our City Key enrollment patterns is to compare characteristics of our survey sample which we use as a proxy for city key enrollees, to demographics in the city of Chicago. So this is a descriptive analysis where you can see that it suggests that marginalized groups were disproportionately more likely to enroll in city key. So for example, when compared to Chicago's population, city key survey respondents were more likely to identify as Latinx, somewhat less likely to identify as Black, much less likely to identify as white. City key respondents were also more likely to have less than a high school diploma, 28% compared to Chicagoans overall, which are at 15%. And we also observe a comparatively higher share of survey respondents who reported being non-citizen immigrants, 45% compared to 18% in the city overall. So we're arguing that these observations provide at least suggestive evidence of strategic system seeking among city key enrollees, but they don't really elucidate the motivations for marginalized groups to enroll in city key and whether they were responding to this administrative justice design, this kind of more open, welcoming design that the city of Chicago tried to embed in the ID program. So let me move just to the last piece of data that I have to share with you today. Here, to examine whether administrative justice design induces strategic system seeking among undocumented people, I'm going to draw again back on our interviews. And first, I'll focus on the reduction of threats in that administrative justice framework. So in terms of threat reduction, what the program was hoping to do, the first example comes here from Marisol. Marisol, 41 years old, from Mexico, said, "When you show the matricula, you're immediately signaled as an immigrant." Overall, undocumented city key enrollees emphasized that having an ID would not flag, that having this ID would not flag immigration status, and that they would not be rejected by establishments where they need to present ID, and this made them feel more secure. Another example of this comes from Tomas. Tomas said, "I feel safer being able to show an ID. It makes me feel legit. As a non-citizen without papers, at least I feel safe because they know I exist here." Linda was 25 years old, from Mexico, but she had DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, one of the very few people who had DACA in our sample. Linda said, "My biggest concern was with the data. How's it going to be used? How's this data going to be stored? Once I understood the process a little bit more and how the city doesn't keep any data, I felt more comfortable, one, to get the city key with my mom, and two, just to overall go through it and tell other people all about it." So now I'll turn to administrative burdens. Administrative burdens, remember, refers to lowering, or what we're suggesting is that the city key tried to reduce or lower administrative burdens, getting rid of costs that might inhibit your program take up. And so we're starting to see this, for example, with Teresa. Teresa was 42 years old, undocumented, from Mexico. Teresa said, when she was talking about getting the city key, that the transportation costs that were reduced for her because the city key came to her neighborhood were important to her. She said, "This way we didn't have to go all the way downtown or whatever. Instead, the program came here to my neighborhood, to the community." Pilar was 48 years old when we interviewed her, undocumented, also originally from Mexico, and she was experiencing housing instability when we interviewed her. She favorably compared the process of getting a municipal ID in Chicago with the process of getting a state ID, noting the flexibility in required documents. She said, "I had all those required documents and I tried to get a state ID and they were like, 'No, you can't use those documents. They're expired. You can't get an ID.' There was no way to convince them. But with the city key, I could bring the same things, those same expired documents, and they said, 'Oh yeah, these are great. I accept these. Here you go.'" The final example comes from Jorge, who was 32, undocumented, and originally from El Salvador. He emphasized the importance of city key being free. He said, "I had no funds, no money, nothing. And I thought, wow, you can get an ID for free? I'm going to get one of those." So the final component in strategic system seeking here and thinking about administrative justice is universal framing. Again, what we're referring to here is the fact that city key did not differentiate by immigration status, but was instead framed for being for all residents, not just for immigrants. And we think this was key to inducing strategic system seeking. I'll give you some evidence of this from our interviews as well. First example comes from Lola, 42 years old, undocumented, also from Mexico. She said, "This is an ID that any person can have. It doesn't distinguish you the way showing a matricula does. This way, no one will know your status." Josefina, also undocumented, was 32 years old from Mexico and agreed. She said obtaining a city key ID was important because it doesn't identify if you are or are not undocumented. And for me, it was like a light went off. I thought this could be really helpful to me. Finally, Carlos was a non-binary 24-year-old undocumented person from Mexico. Here, we're drawing on Carlos's example to emphasize that enrollees in Municipal ID program in Chicago oftentimes had multiple marginalized identities. And they also cited the fact that the ID was universally welcoming as a factor for seeking it out. So Carlos said, "I thought it was very queer friendly. That was one of the reasons why I got City Key. I also thought it was very immigrant friendly, and I'm an immigrant. I'm undocumented. I thought that was cool." So I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of thoughts here. In sum, what we're arguing is that our interviews are demonstrating that undocumented immigrants, our interviews and our surveys, that undocumented immigrants faced a number of challenges due to lacking ID. And in seeking a solution to this very real problem, they cited the administrative justice features of the City Key program in Chicago. This reduced threat, reduced administrative burden, and universal framing is contributing to their decisions to enroll in the program. These accounts illustrate the theoretical framework's relational nature of engagement. And we think in terms of implications, if we're thinking about the way that scholarship might identify tangible solutions to real world problems, this is an optimistic implication I'm going to give you now, that federal restrictions around ID ultimately create an institutional opening from above for municipal governments to come in and do something about a lack of ID. And this opening is reinforced by bottom-up pressure from communities that are excluded from IDs at higher levels of government. And so what we're suggesting is that administrative justice as a policy design helps cities send residents powerful messages about their deservingness, their membership, the city's recognition of their real need for an ID. And that there's potential for these kinds of messages and this kind of reciprocal relationship between marginalized communities and the state, or the city government in this instance, to foster more positive orientations towards government and shift potentially from system avoidance in one aspect, at least, of life to system engagement. So next steps for this project, we have a lot of data on people who are not immigrants. And so we're going to start analyzing strategic system seeking amongst other marginalized groups. Of course, acknowledging that people who are in marginalized groups are not a monolith and will respond to policy according to intersectional social positions. There's really important heterogeneity in this data that we haven't come to explore yet. We're also looking at this through a lens of urban inclusion, both with interviews and a survey experiment that we're working on. And then we completed a second wave of interviews and are working on a book. All of this exciting, daunting.
Sorry, Angela, your audio went out just 1 second right there.
Thank you. I'll say by way of conclusion, thank you to the many, many research assistants that helped us with this and our funders as well. And thank you again for the invitation to join you all today. I'll go ahead and stop sharing now. That's the
Fantastic.
end.
Thank you very, very much. And again, thank you for your patience with the with starting late today. We have a few people connected right now, and as well 3 people watching online through YouTube. It's been going up and down throughout the talk. And so I'll just say a few words at the beginning and let everyone get their questions ready. Hopefully there'll be a few. First, for our project in the Sanctuary Cities as Merging Borders group, it's fantastic to see the work that you're doing because there are an incredible number of bridges and similarities. And also to compare the data, as we're also in the data collection phase right now. Methodologically speaking, I actually didn't even know this, but we're very, very similar. We have the same beginning with a survey. Ours just happens to be incredibly long and a little cumbersome in that respect, but on a good note, at least gives us a lot of extra data to analyze. And we are carrying it out in 6 different cities. Chicago is going to be wrapping up soon. And it's been interesting, like I wrote an email to you before, seeing how many people mentioned that they had the city key card. A few times the response, well, we've written it as municipal ID. And so far in the cities that we've been working in, which were Dallas and Los Angeles, the LA ID card, as far as I understand it, kind of was debated, came into effect, disappeared, and isn't really much of anything now, but it got replaced during the pandemic by something that like helped access services, the Angelino card. And in general, not many people had it. In Chicago, we've got, of our sample so far of around 300 people who all are undocumented, about 5%, a little over that. So around 20 people said that they had the city key card in Chicago. And we haven't really broken down that data yet, right? To see if there's any kind of pattern in terms of what you were talking about, second, third, multiple marginalized identities in terms of socioeconomic background, education, gender, etc. And as well seeing how many other IDs are in play. So Dallas is one of those faith ID places, right? They have a church ID program that was started up right before the pandemic that I was working on a little, and interesting to see some of the similar comments as what you were saying. Like universal framing was perhaps one of the most important things for the church ID program that I was researching, because many people said it's not a matricula. Like showing this church ID doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a migrant. Obviously, matricula doesn't either, but it's gotten that connotation in many contexts. And so the people who started the program were also very quick to say, well, this is something for everyone in the community. It's something to help you feel as part of the community, that you belong. It's a local identification. And obviously the most important thing, the Dallas case, was that 3 city police forces, Carrollton, Dallas, and Farmers Branch, all decide to recognize it officially. Not necessarily putting that in written legislation, but in sort of more of a orally pronounced statement in a big event with hundreds of people in a church. And so it was the question of trust there too, right? That in the end, if that ID card in and of itself, and I know it's not one of the main focuses of the project you have right now, but if it weren't recognized in any case, I'm sure that everything could start tumbling down in the end, because if people are using that, it's all based on the premise that if the police stops me at a stoplight or a stop sign, and I need to show an ID card, they'll accept this without any further questions. And so there's kind of this really, really heavy tension about how much the card will be able to work as an official ID when it's not official, like your case with the municipal one, right? And that's maybe one of my first questions. The breadth, the reach of this. So we're talking about the right to the city. We're talking about the ability of the city to be an actor in migratory affairs, law, policy. How much can this be used outside of a city? What does a city official do if you're moving around the urban area, so Chicagoland, and you end up wandering off into Wisconsin or Indiana? Is there any chance that anyone will actually accept this ID, or will it be something that only works within certain boundaries that few people will recognize other than those who have it? And going along with universal framing, so the comparative thing, I know it's again not the focus, but you do seem to have a lot of data on it, which is fascinating to me, and I'm sure many people in the group. So the New Haven example, right? There are a few of these other ID cards where they try to couple it with many different things, and that goes towards the idea of universal framing. So it's a library card, it's a transportation card. You can put $50 on it and use it in the buses. Is that something that you would see as, let's say, talking about best practices for local ID cards, something that works better, trying to make it more attractive for a broader audience? Or is it really we're in this idea of marginalized groups, we're trying to provide something that has a semblance of universality, but in the end we know that it's helping them out in their contexts, right? So how much is this really intended for the entire population of Chicago? Is there actually an intent to get more people to use this card? And how much is it, let's say, a specifically kind of covert local municipal immigration policy? Um, and let's say, just to finish, I would love to hear more about what you might be finding about the Arkansas case or any of those county IDs, and why it is so much harder to come up with these programs at a county level. Like county, again, probably going to be speaking from a bit of ignorance here, but health services are often very located at the county level, right? And so maybe it might be important for the county level to be issuing this to help further access to clinics or health services that the city might not be able to provide. During COVID, this was pretty apparent, right? So anyhow, I'll stop there. And if you'd like to respond to those, we'll see after if there are any other questions from the audience. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for all those really good questions and for paying attention. I can tell that you were listening to what I said. I think maybe I'll start with this question of universal framing. I think it's a really astute observation that universal framing is doing at least two things in these cases. I think definitely in Chicago, but likely in other cities with municipal ID as well. And that is, the first, it is, I think, reliably reducing stigma and reducing fear for those who sort of have most at stake, people who are the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, right? But I think universal framing, and maybe this is what you're getting at here, is also a very savvy move on behalf of local governments, because by pitching the card as being universal for everybody, for all Chicagoans, for example, is the way it's talked about here. It's a key to the city of Chicago. It is providing some defensive moves for the city to kind of broadcast to, let's say, a hostile federal administration, or to anyone who would maybe want to poke holes in the program or say that the city should not be spending, in a budget stressed time, spending money on this kind of thing. This is the way that the city can say, but this is for everyone. And in a city like Chicago, where there are real tensions between immigrant communities, Latino communities, African American communities, this came to a head when the city council voted on allocating funds, where a lot of our Black congresspeople, a lot of our Black aldermen were saying, is this really going to help my constituents in my ward? And the city is, I think, was playing a fairly savvy card in saying that this is for all Chicagoans, because it is a way of getting more skin in the game, right? So it sort of has a dual, I would say at least two sides of the coin, this universal framing. In terms of kind of what the card does for you outside of municipal lines, right? And we know it's very easy to leave the city of Chicago and move into any other kind of small municipality, or very easy to, Chicago, where I am in Chicago right now, I'm about 6 miles away from Indiana. So I could ride my bike to another state right now if I wanted to, right? And would they accept my city key in Indiana? No, or unlikely. There's no kind of legal teeth holding them to it. Importantly, I think, though, in the city of Chicago, the city key is mandated to be accepted by all city entities. So that means all schools, all police officers, all city offices, all city workers must accept the city key. That's really critical. And there have been long talks. I don't know what will happen. COVID messed up some of this, but the city has been in talks for a long time with the county that surrounds Chicago, Cook County, to talk about having either like recognition of City Key in Cook County or having a card that might include people who live in Cook County as well as people who live in Chicago. So sort of if this much of this is Chicago, adding Cook County would make it this much bigger, right? A jurisdiction that much bigger. And so in terms of best practices, you asked about, you know, these add-ons to the card. It's an ID card, but it's also a library card, a transit card, and best practices around that. I think, you know, those kinds of things can make it very attractive to people to sign up, depending on what they are. So Chicago, for example, offered free entry to one of the museums downtown. It usually costs about $25 to enter. That's a pretty good value for many people, right? That might not be the thing that's going to attract somebody that is low income and undocumented and working a whole heck of a lot to get the card. But the idea is then it would attract somebody that's an ally to the card who may not have those kind of characteristics that would flag them as having some kind of marginalized identity. So I think all that's good. But there are some features of the cards that are probably not great. So for example, when City Key was being designed in Chicago, the organizations that the city brought in to kind of consult and talk about the needs of their communities and having an ID pushed back against the city for its efforts to add a debit card functionality to the City Key because that has proven very expensive with fees in other cities, right? And so a lot of the orgs were saying, hey, we don't want this because it ends up really giving it ends up not being a help to the people that we care about, right? Because they end up paying a whole bunch of fines to banks for taking their money out with this card. And so I think it's not a kitchen sink kind of thing to dump all of the features possible into a card, but thinking really strategically about which features will add to the universality of the card and which features might serve other purposes that wouldn't be so useful. The last thing I was going to say, I think, is I don't have a good answer yet on what's happening in Arkansas and why it's relatively harder to do this, or it seems harder to do this. Maybe it seems harder is not right. Less counties have taken this up than cities. Why, right? Well, first, there's less counties to begin with, so we're working with a smaller number. But also, I think potentially because counties are bigger, they have a larger size constituents. In many cases, they might be somewhat less progressive depending on where they're located. And we think that kind of political leanings do have a role in determining what places adopt these kinds of things. That's why you can see them in a lot of East Coast cities and a lot of West Coast cities and not much in the South, right? So I don't have a pulse on that quite yet, but we do have the RA working quite hard on it. What I can say is one thing that we have uncovered in researching these municipal ID and county ID programs is that there are several organizations, nonprofit organizations, that have sort of figured out a template for how to push municipal IDs forward in their city councils. And they are teaching other orgs to do this work. And so that is part of the reason why you see a whole explosion of these municipal ID cards in small cities in New York and New Jersey, because this org is located in that area and they have figured out this toolkit and they are like really pushing it. And it's been very successful. It's also easier once a bunch of municipalities have put this into place to say, okay, we can do this too. If you're just, next door, it feels less scary maybe for a city to take that step. I hope that answered more or less what you were asking.
Yeah, it's fascinating and also really does explain the, let's say, East Coast explosion when you see the map, right? This coordinated toolkit strategy that but I mean, I've seen it's been analyzed on both sides, obviously, that you have a template letter for your congressperson, you have the petition ready, you have the whole setup that you can just transpose to another city and have a local or an NGO or organization take out the work that a kind of more national or state level organization has already set out and had the lawyers check over for the language and everything, right? And and especially when there's maybe the state versus city conflict that can happen at times. And so I've been kind of wondering if that, obviously Little Rock, and knowing that most cities in the United States lean to the left to different degrees, big cities especially that have diverse immigrant populations, but they might be located in Arizona or Texas or Georgia or wherever. It's kind of that the debate that they had in Dallas trying to start up a municipal ID program. And it was the New York example that, according to some of the interviews that I had, that scared them, right? So if that could happen in New York, where the data might be able to be accessed at the state level, then it would be better to not even try it. And instead it was the local NGOs that took up the sort of the ID fight to bring something to the table. But before I keep going, are there any questions from our participants, our audience here? Any other comments or questions you'd like to, you might have for Dr. Garcia? A second, see if there's anything on the YouTube channel. For the moment, no. Vianney, ¿estás ahí? Are you there? DNA is participating in the project at Phoenix, and actually I was kind of curious about that because Phoenix has a city services card, but I don't know how much that gets used. And in terms of the identification needed to get it, I think you can just show a foreign passport, not necessarily checking the ID, but I don't know to what extent it is accessible or that people use it. But in case you might be around. Well, and so right now, the idea with the New York example, do you see this as something that could pose a real threat to these kinds of programs, or kind of did Chicago find the answer by not collecting data, and there's absolutely nothing that could pose a risk now to anyone who has this card?
I think that's a really good question. One of the things we'd like to do with this project, or we'd like to see happen around municipal IDs, is a real understanding of how cities learn from each other. In tracking municipal IDs emerged after Chicago's, the majority of them are not collecting any administrative data. And so we think that they are learning from Chicago. We held a symposium on municipal IDs just before COVID hit, where we invited a representative from Detroit's program, Minneapolis's program. We had someone from Chicago, and there's a fourth that I'm missing, where we just had them kind of talk to each other about how their programs evolved, how they developed. And we saw there was a lot of informal learning going on, but we wondered, just as sort of activists might have their toolkits that they can, use to push cities' feet to the fire, if progressive actors within cities themselves were talking to each other about how to get one of these programs rolling, we also think there's a lot of knowledge sharing and learning that cities could do from each other, just as they are being pushed from below. And so we would love to see sort of a network of cities that have municipal ID programs formed so that they can be learning from each other and in conversation about best practices, and also have like a research component to them, because I think it's really important that there's no administrative data collected in Chicago and in other programs that have taken that step. I do think it provides a solid protection for people's data. And we know that big data is a thing that can be used for both good and bad. And I think those privacy protections are very important. At the same time, it makes it very hard to study a program that has no data associated with it. You have to create your own data collection. And I think that, cities need that in order to say to the city council, hey, we did this investment and here's what we've been able to reap from it. It's, in my view, it's preferable that a team of trained researchers do that work rather than the city trying to collect the data and then pass it off to somebody else. So I would love to see kind of a, I don't know, a conference, some kind of network of cities with municipal IDs come together so that cities themselves are learning from each other about what might be best.
Do you think any of these organizations, like the ones who attribute welcoming certificates or immigrant friendly, or there's a whole bunch of designations in sort of consultancies slash NGOs that offer these designations now, no, with their own methodology. Do you think they could be actors that could help with that, or maybe something a little more formal, like conferences, of mayors conferences or things like that, where you would bring together like-minded best practices exchanges?
I think I'm assuming that there's probably already mechanisms in place. So I don't know if like a whole new thing needs to be created. And this is a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but of course there's these national conferences for mayors. There's all kinds of ways that you know, there's a whole new network for progressive cities pushing for immigration reform. I would be surprised if the majority of those cities don't have or are not considering a municipal ID. I think it might be able to be infused in an existing structure. But what we noticed or what we learned in Chicago is that there were, you know, some 2 or 3 really key people that weren't like the person in charge of the ID, but were the person that actually did kind of the work of designing the ID, that were fundamental to the ID having these features of being universal, reducing threat, and reducing administrative burden. Those are the people that I want to see get around the table, not necessarily the mayors per se, but the actual bureaucrats that are doing the program design. They were very smart, I think, in collaborating with nonprofit organizations in Chicago. And I think that was an incredibly important first step. You know, if we talk about best practices, that might be square one. Don't try to do this by yourself, city. You know, draw on the resources around you that have a much better pulse on what's happening in the communities of their communities of concern. But yeah, to answer your question, I would imagine there's probably an entity that's already doing some of this work. It would be a question of sort of, you know, targeting it or focusing it towards municipal ID.
All right, I've got one slightly harder one that I was curious about, because I obviously don't have the answer. In our data, as I mentioned, it's very low, the number of people who have the municipal ID in the case of Chicago, right? And obviously, I'm not talking about a representative sample or anything like that, but it just so happens to be 300 or so undocumented Mexicans who live in Chicago, of whom only 5%, 5-6% have the card. And this would have been now, what, 2 years after the program was put into, between a year and 2 years after the program was put into place. Do you think that this is because, talking about strategic system seeking, they might not have as much need, there might not have been enough information or communication that filtered down to them so that they know what the program was. So we didn't go into detail, and in the qualitative interviews that we're doing as a follow-up, it kind of shows up there, but we haven't had that many yet. So I'm just kind of curious. I was expecting, for instance, in the case of Chicago, for there to be a greater proportion of people who might have that. Nothing like 50% or anything, right? But maybe more than 5. I'm not sure. Do you think that that might speak to problems with the program, or just lack of necessity, or a continuing feeling of threat and risk associated with anything, like you were mentioning before, government?
That's a great question. Again, I also don't have a firm answer, but can sort of hypothesize what might be going on potentially. But also just to say, like, to underscore what you said, it's hard to know because you don't have a universal sample and we don't either. So we're sort of trying to compare things in that way. My gut instinct is that the municipal ID program in Chicago was very, 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 very successful in the beginning, almost too successful. There were not enough city workers on hand to process these IDs. The lines were very long on very hot days. That example that I gave to start off the talk with Carmen, who had been there literally since 3 a.m. the night before, is not uncommon. People were sleeping in their cars or taking turns waiting in line. I think there was a huge amount of demand, and that might have turned people off. It's hard to wait in line all day for a municipal ID. The city, learned really quickly that demand was more than it had expected, and asked the orgs that it had been working with to stop promoting the program so actively. But that didn't even matter because the city in Chicago had spent no dollars on promotional materials. It was relying on the orgs to do the promotion. New York dumped a ton of money into promoting it and had, things up on buses and billboards. Chicago didn't do that work because it was overwhelmed without having done that work. I think that might be part of it. I'm guessing that might be part of it, is what I'm saying. Let's see. I think other aspects of this might be, what happened during COVID. So, Chicago started in May of 2018. So it had, a good less than 2 years to really get rolling. And another thing that we're collecting on these municipal ID programs that we've identified as existing in the United States is what did they do during COVID? Did they stop issuing cards? Did they issue cards remotely? How did their enrollment programs shift due to COVID? Some of them closed completely. Detroit's program closed completely. Certainly a lot of them scaled way, 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 way back. So I think that's another question. Another thing I was going to tell you just as anecdotally about why Chicago found itself kind of overwhelmed with the positive response for the card without having done this promotional work. In sort of trying to respond to that and get more workers on the ground, it found itself in a struggle with unionized workers who didn't have as part of their contract that they would be processing municipal ID cards. And so literally were prohibited by their union contract to hit print on the printer button for these municipal ID cards until that could get worked into a new contract that then the union had to ratify. And so given, the strength of unionized labor in cities, I mean, we don't have a very strong unionized labor force in the US in general, but, most city workers are unionized. This is something that the city did not plan for and wasn't expecting, but became kind of a hurdle in staffing the places where people were getting enrolled, such that the city clerk herself was there pressing the print button. Kind of higher level people that you would not expect to be in these places, except for maybe a photo op or something, were there kind of processing the applications because of this wrinkle. So another instance where cities could maybe learn from each other and plan for that in advance.
That's a great last example of sort of the obstacles that aren't expected that then turn into big hurdles to programs where a pre-existing framework really does not take into account the more innovative kinds of reframing these ID cards, right?
Right. You've frozen. I don't know if I'm frozen for you as well. Oh.
Only
I think
he's
we may have.
frozen.
I think we may have lost connection here.
Well, it seems that the universe is conspiring to make this a relatively difficult seminar today. Are there any other questions or comments from our audience for Dr. Garcia about her work? We obviously will also have this transmission on our website afterwards, and will be on YouTube for anyone who might be watching in the future right now. Thank you for your attention as well. And well, I think maybe I'll still do one last question, and hoping that the internet continues for me here. And I was wondering, with the change that you're doing now with the project, so as I understand, it's moving away from migration towards marginalization in general, and looking at strategic system seeking as a much broader way of understanding relations between marginalized groups and government. Is there still going to be any kind of focus on undocumented or marginalized migrants within the rest of the work, or is it really much broader that you're looking at right now in terms of a global perspective?
Great question. We're not totally sure. We have several papers out that have a migration focus, and those will hopefully be published soon, or in the review process. But the culmination of this work we anticipate being a book, and the book will have immigrants as an important part, but the book will, as you suggested, be looking at marginalized groups much more broadly in Chicago, with undocumented people as one of those marginalized groups. What we'd like to do is sort of understand individuals' experiences kind of in a comparative way. So for example, for someone who's undocumented, threat might be really important when we think about approaching the state. So the fact that no identifying data is collected might be critical. But for someone who is low income and Black in Chicago, the data piece might be the most compelling piece. It might be more about administrative burden and not having to pay or drive across town in order to receive this ID. What I find striking are some of the commonalities that we see across our cases too. For example, literally everyone under the sun except for, well, I should say literally everyone under the sun that we interviewed expressed the importance of having an ID for purposes of showing it to the police, which sort of shows you the very heavy role that police and interaction with police plays in the United States generally, but in Chicago in particular, and in particular in the neighborhoods that are less supported, more marginalized by the state, have less services and the like. People are more likely to interact with the state vis-a-vis interaction with a police officer, maybe than any other instance. And so we're going to try to tease out some of those commonalities, but also some of the special features of the ID for individual groups, knowing that, of course, marginalized groups have different nuances, right, and different experiences with the state.
Yeah, the police interaction question always kind of is quite recurring for why you need the ID, right? And that's what we've had frequently too. And it's kind of where I guess our curiosity, my curiosity, in terms of cases where there might be more need, let's say. I mean, it's also very debatable, right, about the discourse that's around sanctuary cities, sanctuary policies, and then what the actual police force does when there's interaction with migrants can be very different. But going off a hypothesis that, let's say you live in a sanctuary city and the police does not ask about migratory background or status or anything, then maybe you do show your matricula without worrying, or you do show your passport, and you have less need, let's say, for that card. And one of the things that was fascinating with the Dallas case, as I mentioned a few times at least, was just seeing how far you could go beyond, like, because of the metropolitan area being such a patchwork there too. Like Farmers Branch was one of the big cases of kind of very, very hostile local government before, right? And now the question of being able to use that card there, but maybe in the city that's literally in the same urban area, you just go a few streets over, but they have a different police force. Well, maybe they don't accept it. Or if you strolled out of the county or drove out by accident, like you were mentioning with Indiana, Then all of a sudden you're with a different police force, and you have to avoid crossing that boundary if you're using this ID card the whole time is something that really must weigh on the minds of some people when they're thinking, what ID can I show, right?
Yeah, when you had asked me something earlier that I wanted to mention, but now say it in response to this. We have not done, but people have done a few audit studies on municipal IDs and whether or not they're accepted, kind of in everyday life. We've asked people about this. I've tried it myself. I had an interaction with the police, and I thought I'm going to show them my city key and see what happens. See if they accept it. And they did. They didn't raise an eye, but I might not be the perfect person to do an audit study. But there were at least the audit study that I'm drawing to mind right now was done in Washtenaw County, the county that surrounds the Detroit area. Or that's not right. The county that surrounds the area where the University of Michigan is, Ann Arbor, the Ann Arbor, Michigan area. And they found what might not be super surprising, that in many cases, the municipal ID card was not accepted, and in particular was not accepted, for example, if someone's first language wasn't English, or kind of the darker, more racialized presentation they had of self on the street also was correlated with the ID not being accepted, those kinds of things. I think I would love to see a really robust audit study on this. I would have liked to seen it at the beginning stages of enrolling a ID program, and then in the middle and the end. I think with COVID in the Chicago case, it's a little unfair to do an audit study right now because the program, and I think every city has just been, the cities still are reeling with, everything, all the fallout of COVID. And I think maybe rightly so, emphasis hasn't been so much on ID programs. But now that we are starting to return to maybe a new normal, and cities are looking to, again, expand, connect with these groups, I would like to see an audit study, a really robustly done audit study of municipal IDs to see if they are accepted in schools, if they are accepted by police, if they are accepted by banks and these kinds of spaces.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. I agree with you entirely, and especially what we're interested in, but it is a methodological difficult, the geographical extent, right? Because we're talking about these urban, these metropolitan areas with no metropolitan government, and so Chicago and Dallas and Los Angeles can do what they want, but the minute that I'm in Huntington Beach in Orange County, what's my LA card matter? And the moment I wander over to Indiana, same thing, or leave sort of the Dallas area. And to what extent too that these local governments, like the local political fights that there can be, and how much they can be wandering into a bit of a local minefield between rivalries between cities, how they perceive each other. And it gets obviously more complicated, right? But taking into account where many people who are marginalized might live and where they might work and where they're moving from one place to another, and sort of keeping those points A, B, and transitory area all secure or somewhat safe is obviously more complicated than just having. It depends on the city, depends on so many different local contexts, right? But I think taking a lot of your time. Thank you very much for all of the answers and for the patience with the presentation and technical problems. And for us with the project, I'm sure many of my colleagues will have things to say afterwards as well. So thank you again for everything that you presented to us today. And I hope that we can continue in contact and learn from each other's projects, especially as you move forward with the next phase and the potential book coming out.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, for the invitation, and thank you for those of you that were here. And disculpa de nuevo que les hablara tanto en inglés. Para la próxima en español, les doy la palabra.
Perfecto, pues muchísimas gracias, Ángela, y gracias a todos y todos que están aquí presentes. deseo muy buena tarde o día, dependiendo de dónde se encuentran, y vamos a seguir con el ciclo de seminarios en unas semanas, tal vez unos meses, con nuestra próxima ponencia. Gracias y pues hasta luego. Gracias, Ángela.